What would you risk to speak out against injustice? Even your life? In the heart of El Salvador, a country torn by violence and inequality, a humble priest named Oscar Romero found himself facing this very question, a question that would not only define his life, but ultimately his death and his legacy for generations to come. Oscar Romero was not always known as a revolutionary. Born in 1917 in Ciudad Barrios, he grew up in a simple household, learning the values of hard work and faith from his parents. As a young man, Oscar felt a deep calling to the priesthood, dedicating himself to the rituals and responsibilities of the church. He was quiet, conservative, and cautious, believing that change came slowly and that the church should avoid politics. For many years, he was regarded as a safe choice, someone unlikely to rock the boat in a society where religious leaders were expected to steer clear of controversy. But El Salvador was changing. By the 1970s, the country was in crisis. The gap between the rich and poor had become a chasm, with vast estates controlled by a handful of families, while the majority struggled to survive on scraps. The government, terrified of revolution and desperate to maintain control, responded to unrest with brutal force. Protesters were met with bullets. Activists disappeared without a trace. The church, too, was divided. Some priests sided with the poor, risking their lives to demand justice, while others remained silent, afraid of reprisal. It was in this climate that Oscar Romero was appointed Archbishop of San Salvador in 1977. To many, it seemed a safe choice, a bishop who would maintain the status quo and avoid conflict. But everything changed when Romero's close friend, Father Rutilio Grande, was murdered for speaking out on behalf of the poor. Romero, devastated by the loss, began to see the suffering around him with new eyes. The cautious priest transformed into a courageous prophet. Week after week, Romero stood at the pulpit of the cathedral, his voice ringing out across the nation. He condemned the violence, the corruption, the oppression that plagued El Salvador. He named the injustices that others feared to speak aloud. He called upon soldiers and government officials to lay down their arms, reminding them that no order could justify the killing of innocent people. His sermons were broadcast on the radio, reaching even the most remote villages. For many, his words were a lifeline, a sign that someone cared, that someone dared to speak truth to power. But courage comes at a cost. Romero's outspoken defense of the poor made him a target. Death threats arrived regularly. Friends urged him to flee, to seek safety abroad, but Romero refused. "If they kill me," he once said, "I will rise again in the Salvadoran people." He understood the risks, but he believed that faith could not remain silent before injustice. To be a disciple was to be prophetic, even when dangerous. On March 24, 1980, Archbishop Oscar Romero stood at the altar of a small chapel, celebrating Mass for a group of nuns and lay people. As he raised the chalice, a single shot rang out. Romero fell, his blood mingling with the wine, a final act of sacrifice. The assassin had silenced his voice, but his message could not be killed. In the days that followed, tens of thousands gathered to mourn. They wept not only for the man, but for the hope he had inspired. Romero had become, in the words of his people, the voice of the voiceless. His legacy endured even as violence continued to ravage El Salvador. The seeds he planted grew into a movement for justice, inspiring activists, theologians, and ordinary people across the world. Romero's life challenges us to consider: what does faith require of us in the face of injustice? Is it enough to pray for the suffering, or must we raise our own voices, even when the cost is high? Romero's example reminds us that true discipleship is not passive. It is active, prophetic, and sometimes perilous. To follow Christ is to stand with the oppressed, to risk comfort for the sake of compassion, to speak when silence would be easier. Today, Oscar Romero is recognized as a saint, not because he was perfect, but because he was faithful. He listened to the cries of the poor and answered with courage. His words echo across time. Let those who have a voice speak out for the voiceless. In a world still marked by inequality and violence, Romero's challenge remains urgent. Where, in your own life, is God asking you to be a voice for the voiceless? Perhaps you see injustice at work, a colleague treated unfairly, a community neglected, a policy that harms the vulnerable. It may be tempting to remain silent, to look away, convincing yourself that someone else will take a stand. But Romero's story teaches us that great change often begins with small acts of courage. You do not need to be a bishop or a public figure to make a difference. Sometimes, speaking up in a meeting, writing a letter, or offering support to someone in need is the prophetic act that sets transformation in motion. Consider the people around you, the ones whose stories go unheard, whose struggles are hidden. What would happen if you listened deeply, if you let their pain move you to action? Romero's life is a testament to the power of empathy, the strength of solidarity. When we choose to stand with the marginalized, we become part of a movement larger than ourselves, a movement for justice, dignity, and peace. Remember, courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act in spite of it. Romero felt fear. He knew the risks, but he chose love over safety, truth over silence. His sacrifice was not in vain. It reminds us that one voice, raised in compassion and conviction, can shake the foundations of injustice. As you reflect on Romero's legacy, ask yourself, where is your pulpit? Where can you speak out, even in small ways, for those who cannot? Your classroom, your workplace, your neighborhood, your family. These are the places where your voice matters. Do not underestimate the impact of your words, your choices, your courage. Start small, but speak with conviction. Let Romero's story inspire you to live your faith boldly, to stand with the voiceless, to risk comfort for the sake of justice. For in every act of compassion, every word of truth, the legacy of Saint Oscar Romero lives on, calling us to build a world where dignity and peace prevail.